everybody, and welcome to the Sex Lecture of the Centre for Social Research in Health. My name is Carla Trelaw and I have the pleasure of being the Director of the Centre. So our centre is extremely lucky to have two ambassadors for our program, Michael Kirby, who's with us today, and Bill Botel, who unfortunately is overseas and can't join us. And I believe it was Michael's idea to have the Sex Lecture, so if anything goes wrong, it's all on your shoulders, Michael. But as a way to bring the ideas we're thinking about all the time, the kind of material that we're engaging with, and to present it to an audience who also wants to engage in these really provocative, challenging times. That said, what will happen today is we'll ask Michael to introduce our key speaker, who's Martin Holt from our centre, and maybe reflect on some of the issues and ideas in his mind about sex in the 21st century. So without further ado, I'll ask Michael to share with us what he's been thinking about.
Thank you very much, Professor Trelaw, and I too would like to start by acknowledging the Indigenous people of our land, and in particular the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, remembering that they are a minority in Australia, their own land, and a minority even smaller than the LGBTIQ minority. They have suffered greatly. They have suffered as a result of the law. They suffered deprivation, humiliation, and distinctions and discrimination which were completely unjust. Earlier today, I launched a book that was written by Dr Virginia Marshall on aqua nullius. This is the deprivation of water rights to Aboriginal people. And later today, I will be launching a book on drones and international human rights law. And here, planted in the middle, is the Sex Lecture, which is entirely appropriate. I can't see how I can work those different themes together, and so I won't really try. But in the early 1940s, a scholar in Bloomington, Indiana, working as a zoologist, a professor of zoology in the Indiana University, announced that he was going to give a sex lecture. It was to be, he didn't call it that in those days, he called it a lecture on marriage guidance, and it was designed to inveigle young male and female students at the university to come along in order to hear the research that he was commencing on sex. The researcher, of course, was the great Alfred Kinsey, and he was the professor of zoology at Indiana University. He was in fact a specialist in gall wasps, which are a member of the bee family, and he was the greatest expert on gall wasps on our planet. He had millions of samples of gall wasps, and he studied them incessantly and had done so since the 1910s. And in particular, he'd studied their sexual and mating behaviour. And then suddenly, in the 1930s, he got the brilliant idea to transfer his attention to human beings and to study sex in human beings. There was, of course, a tremendous hubbub about it, and there was a lot of criticism of him. But fortunately, the university at the time had a president, like a vice-chancellor, who was named Herman Wells. He was a man who, and I mention this just as a footnote because it's no way relevant, was not married. He went to all university functions with his mother as his hostess, the first lady of the university, And when the pressure came from the Cardinal of Indianapolis and from the Congress or the legislature in Indiana to stop him with his research, he said the immortal words, "If what Dr. Kinsey wants to do is a legitimate matter of scientific research, it will be done at Indiana University." And he protected and upheld Alfred Kinsey in his research. That research led on in 1946 to sexual behaviour in the human male, and in 1953 to the report Sexual Behaviour in the Human Female. And these two efforts of social science research made a profound difference because they enlivened community debate about many of the laws that existed in the United States and at the same time in Australia and so many other countries, oppressing, criminalising, humiliating and denigrating LGBTIQ people. And the result of his research was to lead on to a worldwide movement for reform and change of laws and of social attitudes so that they would be based on research, information, rationality, knowledge, not medieval hobgoblins and people's fears and ignorant speculation. So I honour at this function today, which is a function of the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras Festival and also of the Centre for Social Research in Health, I honour Alfred Kinsey and his social science research. Recently I've been attending 3 United Nations meetings which are the children of this social science research of Kinsey and of others. A meeting last December of the Reference Group on Human Rights of UNAIDS, meetings connected with the appointment of the first independent expert of the Human Rights Council on sexual orientation and gender identity, and a meeting a week ago in Bellagio in Italy on the subject of the overreach of criminal law. The appointment of the independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity gathered up a huge opposition in the United Nations. There was a huge attempt by the African group to stop it in its track. And votes were forced in the 3rd committee of the General Assembly, which is the political committee, human rights is dealt with there, and then when they were lost in the 5th committee, the budget committee, to cut off the money. And the votes were very close, 82, 78, 16. If some of the 16 abstainers had voted no, then it would have been killed. Or if some of the absentees had turned up, it would have been killed. But the vote, though by a whisker, continued the effort of the United Nations to deal with discrimination and violence against LGBTIQ people worldwide. So things are changing and developing. The meeting in Bellagio was actually very interesting because it wasn't just looking at LGBTIQ issues of the overreach of criminal law. It was also looking at the unfairness of the criminal law targeting women and women's reproductive health. It was the issues of drug use and the overreach of the criminal laws against people who use drugs to such an extent that in the United States of America, 1.5 million people are in prison on drug use, and building prisons is the 2nd biggest industry of building in the United States. So these were issues which the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is also looking at. So out of social science research can grow action which is designed to change the law and change social attitudes and change the way our society looks upon minorities and to uphold fundamental human rights and dignity. Now, our speaker on this occasion is Associate Professor Martin Holt. He is engaged in research on the prevention of HIV in gay and bisexual men. So I have much pleasure in inviting to deliver the first sex lecture, May It Have the Impact of the Sex Lecture, of Dr. Alfred Kinsey. Martin Holt.
Right. Thank you very much, Michael, for that kind introduction. No pressure, following in the footsteps of Kinsey. Okay, so firstly, I think we should acknowledge that nobody particularly likes being told what to do about sex. Well, unless you have a particular kink for being instructed, and we should acknowledge that that is a thing for some people. However, we are generally interested in sex and other people's sex lives, even if we are encouraged to be discreet about that interest. Mardi Gras, of course, seems like an entirely fitting event to discuss sex, given its role in making gender and sexuality more visible to the public in a confident way. So let's consider this less of a lecture and more of an invitation to think about and discuss how sex, particularly safe sex, is changing in response to newer forms of HIV prevention. Firstly, let's think about sex itself. You might want to wistfully gaze into the distance or glance at that person you just located on Grindr or Tinder. The main point I want to make about sex is its sheer wonder and diversity, and so this links very well to what Michael was saying about Kinsey. I'd argue that however, it's a lot more complicated and fun than the dry conjugal relations depicted in textbooks, or the grunting, sweaty pneumatics shown in pornography. There's an enormous range of ways in which consenting adults can come together, pun was intended there, excite each other and give and receive pleasure. And I noticed when I was reviewing this earlier, it's lucky I've got consenting adults in here, given some of the coverage from the US at the moment. Our bodies are incredibly varied, and there are many, many ways to stimulate those bodies. And we can perhaps think of Mardi Gras as a time and an experiment when that range of connection and pleasure gets that little bit broader and wilder. Now, other than the physicality of sex, I want us to acknowledge the myriad ways that we organise sex, then perform and experience it, and how we carry those experiences forward into new relationships, new situations, and new encounters. There is an amazing diversity of sexual experience, yet we see patterns and practices emerge and persist over time. And safe sex is one of those assemblages that persists. Take, for example, the ways in which we seek out and organise sex. If you are lucky and appealing to others, you may find that the promise of sex is routinely and spontaneously on offer as you meet people on the street, at parties, at the shops, the beach, or at work. Then may follow the tango of working out how interested someone is. The awkward or bold first conversation, arranging a date or drink, and trying to suss out whether that spark is enough to pursue them further or drag them home. Many of us, however, don't rely on chance encounters, and we go out of our way to look for and arrange sex. We go online, we swipe our phone apps into submission, browsing the torsos, selfies, winning smiles, and disembodied genitalia on offer. That probably gives you a sense of the kind of outlets I use. We advertise our most winning features and disguise or minimise others. We can signal an impressive range of esoteric interests and techniques, or emphasise the sex we know we do best. Alternatively, we can go to bars looking for a pleasurable distraction, if you can find one that's open in Sydney. Okay, there's a kind of a keep Sydney open. Or saunas or parties where there is a common purpose to have sex. Weather permitting, certain parks and streets may hold potential, particularly after dark. When a promising partner is found and taken home or into a corner or cubicle, you may know quite a lot about them, if you have previously had a date, or a days long to and fro by app, determining what each other is into and how hot you find each other ad nauseum. On the other hand, a chance, more immediate encounter with less prior knowledge has its own excitements, pushing us to improvise and determine in situ what the other person wants and what they're willing to do with you. The setting, of course, further mixes up the potential for variation. The bedroom can lend itself to the slow or steady meeting, or the long, intense and intimate encounter. An indoor setting might lend itself to speed and excitement, and the sauna or sex party offers multiple chances to couple and recouple, perhaps in a group. This variation in the ways we find partners, our expectations of them, the places we have sex, and the colossal range in our body shapes, sizes and capacities affects the sex we have, our enjoyment of it, and what we take forward to the next encounters and relationships. This buzzing, thrilling diversity makes it even more of an achievement that we can create something like safe sex and keep it going across decades. So what is safe sex? On a dry level, it is what we do to prevent HIV transmission during sex. At a community level, and particularly for gay men, safe sex was vital to assert that people could still have sex despite the threat of HIV. In common parlance, safe sex generally means condom use for penetrative sex or avoiding penetration and focusing on other forms, digital stimulation, oral sex, using tongues and fingers and hands, toys and other equipment. However, condoms have a particular prominence when people are asked what safe sex is, suggesting that decades of promoting condoms for penetrative sex and keeping many bananas safe during school sex ed lessons have welded themselves in people's imaginations. Origin stories of safe sex are quite common and are sometimes hotly debated, particularly in histories of HIV. I recently saw a research piece from Canada which claimed that doctors and public health authorities had decided in the early period of the epidemic that using condoms would be a good way to limit the sexual transmission of HIV. But here, in Australia, that origin story would be contested. Here it is generally thought that gay men and sex workers arrived at the conclusion that HIV must be transmitted during sex and that condoms, as a barrier method, would limit the chance of transmission. This view was formed well before there was an official consensus about what HIV was and how it could be contained. So in a climate of acute fear and concern about friends and lovers falling sick, gay men and sex workers urged their peers through informal community meetings, activism and outreach to get condoms and use them to make fucking safe. Only subsequently did doctors and public health officials agree that this community expertise was vital to limit the burgeoning epidemic, providing a basis for safe sex education and the community organisations like ACON, SWAP, Positive Life and AFAO that we know today. So thinking back to my earlier remarks about the diversity of sexual practice that we engage in, it's useful to remind ourselves what a remarkable achievement safe sex is and was. It is not governments and organisations that keep safe sex going, although they often encourage us to do so. Safe sex has required affected communities to act collectively to protect each other and to support each other and keep that action going for 30 years. Let's think about gay men in particular, and I apologise if they're not your primary interest, but they're my peers and with whom I do most of my research, and they remain the group most affected by HIV in Australia. When faced with the threat of HIV in the 1980s, they rapidly adopted condom use as their primary strategy to protect each other during anal sex. Condom use for casual sex was then sustained at remarkably high levels over decades, levels that were never observed among heterosexual men and women. Across the range of sexual encounters that gay men engaged in, they encouraged and cajoled partners to rubber up, developing expertise and confidence in suggesting and using condoms. Once community organisations, doctors and governments endorsed and supported condom use as a prevention strategy, condom use rapidly became a norm for gay men, a standard which people were expected to conform to, whether they actually did so or not. Now, norms are of course useful things, but they also have costs. The value of a norm is that it guides us about what to do in unfamiliar situations and reassures us that others will also behave the same way. But if you don't adhere to the rule or standard that others expect, you may be judged or penalised, and you may find yourself labelled as disreputable or irresponsible. So the price of successfully turning safe sex into a norm is that it positions those who don't always use condoms as problematic. And that has created headaches for gay men and HIV prevention for over 20 years, and other groups as well. What many don't realise is that condom use has never been universally practised for anal sex by gay men. This is the power of a norm. It can fool us into thinking that everyone is doing the same thing. The uptake of condom use was undoubtedly dramatic during the late 80s and early 90s, but it was not uniform. As many of us know, condoms can be awkward and difficult to use, and there were always some men who couldn't or wouldn't use them with every partner. In the early 90s, we also started to see alternatives to condom use. My colleagues were among the first to realise that gay men in relationships were quite unlikely to use condoms with their boyfriends, but generally used condoms for casual sex. While some American researchers saw this as a failure or a relapse from safe sex, in Australia this strategy was recognised as an extension or adaptation of safe sex. Men were using HIV testing to work out whether it was safe to have sex without condoms with their main partners and continued to use condoms with unfamiliar ones. This strategy became known as negotiated safety. After effective HIV treatments became available in the mid-1990s and the threat of HIV was diminished, consistent condom use by gay men started to gradually decline here and elsewhere. In parallel, a range of other strategies created by gay men to reduce HIV risk were identified. The most well-known is probably serosorting, limiting sex without condoms to partners believed to be the same HIV status as you. Now, serosorting was first practised and noticed among HIV-positive men, and then we noticed it among some HIV-negative men. These alternatives to condoms gradually became more commonly used, but they were never embraced by the majority of gay men. Condoms remained the norm for casual sex, the default position, even as condom use every time was becoming less common. That brings us to late 2010 and PrEP, and you would have probably had to have been under a rock not to have heard about PrEP by now. In December 2010, the results of a large international trial of pre-exposure prophylaxis, taking antiretroviral drugs every day to prevent HIV infection, were published in the New England Journal of Medicine, a very prestigious medical journal. The overall results showed a modest 44% reduction in HIV infection, but the many trial participants, who were generally gay and bisexual men and some transgender women, had not been taking the drug at sufficient levels to achieve protection. Those who had taken the drug regularly and had maintained detectable levels achieved a 92% reduction in the risk of infection. This was an extraordinary result and has been subsequently been repeated in multiple follow-up studies, particularly with gay and bisexual men. If you maintain high detectable levels of the drug, Truvada, you are protected from HIV. This understandably was big news, given it suggested a new, highly effective way to prevent HIV, as or more effective than condoms. 8 months later, in August 2011, another large international study also published its results in the New England Journal of Medicine. The study had followed 1,700 heterosexual couples where one partner was HIV positive and the other HIV negative. The study assessed the risk of infection for the HIV-negative partners if the positive partners started treatment immediately after diagnosis or if they delayed treatment. This result was also extraordinary. In couples where the positive partner started treatment immediately, there was a 96% reduction in the risk of infection for the HIV-negative partners. That's why Science magazine called it Breakthrough of the Year. Now, current studies looking at treatment as prevention among gay and bisexual men, including one that's run from here at the Kirby Institute, suggest it is equally effective in preventing transmission during anal sex. So in the space of a year, there were two major developments in HIV prevention showing that the regular use of antiretroviral drugs can prevent HIV infection or transmission. While it took a few years for these results to be converted into policies and then action, PrEP and treatment as prevention have been embraced internationally, and they're positioned as game-changing strategies that can help turn the tide of the epidemic and end HIV. Here in Australia, particularly New South Wales, the benefits of treatment for health and prevention have been promoted to the community, and large publicly funded projects have been set up to make PrEP accessible to people at high risk of HIV, particularly gay men. The uptake here in Sydney alone has been quite extraordinary, with thousands coming forward to join the EPIC study, and the study continues to enrol people across the state. So what does this mean for how we think about and do safe sex? I think there is a question about whether the norm of safe sex that I mentioned before will change as PrEP becomes more visible and commonly used, and as more of us understand the benefits of HIV treatment for prevention. Now, I use the very catchy term antiretroviral sex in the title of my talk because it's unclear to me if the idea of safe sex being condoms will really shift, and we may need alternative terms. Don't worry, I don't think that one will catch on. One thing I think we should consider is the scale of change required. How many people do need to start using PrEP and treatment as prevention before they are considered normal among gay men or any other community? They've certainly become much more visible in the last few years, but even among gay men, they are only used by a minority. As I said before, we have seen a range of strategies other than condoms emerge over the last 25 years. But they've not really shaken the idea that safe sex equals condoms or that sex without condoms equals unsafe sex. This comes through again and again in qualitative research done by Bridget, my colleague Dean Murphy, and Halverson, Christy Newman at the Centre for Social Research and Health. The vernacular that people use to describe and think about safety and risk is heavily indebted to 30 years of condoms being the norm for safe sex. A second consideration is the time frame. How long does it take to create a new norm? Another 30 years? The health department really does not want it to take 30 years. Probably not. But if the history of the epidemic tells us anything, it is that we will have to spend years embedding PrEP and treatment as prevention as effective strategies, and then many additional years sustaining them. Now, PrEP and treatment as prevention bring many opportunities, and great optimism has been expressed at their potential to break down barriers, particularly between HIV positive and HIV negative people, and particularly to tackle the stigma that HIV positive people face. Among gay men, even a passing engagement with sex-seeking sites and apps shows the proliferation of men confidently stating that they are neg and on PrEP or pos and undetectable. However, recent surveys of gay men, which we've done at the Centre for Social Research and Health or by my colleagues at the Burnett and Kirby Institutes, suggest some bumps in the road that will need to be navigated. On the PrEP front, we see encouraging signs that more and more people have heard about it, know something about it, and support it being made available, particularly if we can get it listed on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. Let's see if we can make that happen. The people we want to be interested in PrEP, those most at risk of HIV, are generally the ones most willing to use it, although not everyone is comfortable with the idea of taking medication. However, when we ask broader questions, we get a murkier picture. Now, when we last asked them at my centre, only a third of gay men said they would be willing to have sex with someone on PrEP, with or without condoms. Now, that may be a sign of unfamiliarity or that PrEP isn't relevant for some men, but it could also reflect discomfort and suspicion about men on PrEP. Now, here in Australia, we seem to have dodged the whole Truvada whore slut-shaming debacle that occurred in the US, and this is a picture from there. But I still think we need to guard against PrEP users being judged as disreputable or irresponsible, as that impedes effective prevention. And there are signs that being an early adopter of PrEP requires confidence in negotiating with partners who may have unrealistic expectations of what you're prepared to do. For instance, another survey conducted towards the end of last year, led by the Kirby Institute, suggests that PrEP users are equally likely to be rejected by potential partners for 3 different reasons. 1, that they're on PrEP. 2, that the PrEP user suggests not using condoms. Or 3, that the PrEP user actually says, no, we should use condoms. So think about that. They can be rejected for 3 different reasons. Actually, after positive men, PrEP users are currently the men most likely to be rejected by potential partners. Go Australia. And over a third of PrEP users report being rejected for each of those reasons at the moment. So what this suggests to me is that, sure, some PrEP users are looking for sex without condoms, and they may be rejected by others because of that. However, PrEP users may also be sought out as partners for bareback sex, and they may refuse to do that with men who aren't also on PrEP or treatment. All this stuff is being worked out right now by the vanguard of PrEP users and their partners. Now, when we turn to treatment as prevention, we also see promising but mixed signs. We, at the Centre for Social Research and Health, have recorded massive increases in the belief that HIV treatment can prevent transmission. I know ACON has seen the same kind of changes, particularly among HIV-positive gay men and their partners. Awareness has grown among HIV-negative men, but it still lags way behind their positive peers. And growing awareness of treatment as prevention does not necessarily translate into comfort or confidence in having sex with positive men, the vast majority of whom in Australia are on treatment and have an undetectable viral load, and that's what the +U symbol means here. The -P means negative and on PrEP, and these are kind of community-generated symbols. When we ask positive men about it, the majority continue to say that they have been rejected by potential partners simply because they are positive, not because of the sex they were going to have. Half of HIV-negative men say they are not willing to countenance sex with positive men at all, even if the sex is entirely safe. Fear and prejudice against positive men is ingrained. Now, PrEP users are more open to having sex with positive men, but even a third of them say they wouldn't have sex with any HIV-positive person. We have a long way to go before we break down these barriers and build confidence in antiretroviral sex. Finally, I think we should remember that this is all being figured out right now on the ground by people having sex with each other and working out what they feel comfortable doing. The onus at the moment is on people using PrEP and HIV treatment, but there is a much bigger cohort who now find that what they assumed was normal practice has changed. This kind of disruption can lead to misunderstandings, rejection, and upset if people are unprepared or they lack confidence in what they are willing to request or do. That's why this new campaign, recently launched by ACON at the start of the Mardi Gras festival, is welcome. It's highlighting 3 effective ways to prevent HIV: condoms, PrEP, and HIV treatment, and encouraging gay men to choose the right one for them. It's also encouraging people to support each other in the choices they make at a time when things are exciting but also confusing. To transform safe sex and make it work, we will need kindness, generosity, and patience, in my view, qualities that can be hard to find in the brutal rollercoaster worlds of sex and dating, particularly in Sydney. I'm optimistic that we can make this happen, but we will need to guard against our baser instincts to judge and reject others because they do things differently. If we can do that, I think we will get closer to the dream of ending HIV. Thank you.
We do have some time now for questions and answers. I've just realised, yes, I can see we have some roving microphones here. Just while we wait for those microphones to settle, Martin, can I ask you, you made 2 really interesting comparisons between the Australian response and the US response. Firstly, with regard to negotiated safety, where you said that was seen as a failure in the US, whereas it was seen as an extension or an adaptation in Australia. And secondly, with regard to the Truvada whore thing that happened in the US, why do you think we see this politics of health promotion playing out differently in these 2 contexts?
Thanks, Bridget, and thank you for letting me pause and drink something. Yeah, so I think one of the most obvious things to comment on is the difference in culture between Australia and the US. And I think we were quite fortunate here to embrace a more sex-positive culture, particularly in the response to HIV. And I think in the US, unfortunately, some more conservative public health authorities held more sway. And so it was quite difficult in those early decades. I mean, there were very strong community responses in the US as well, but often the people who got to make the decisions at the Centres for Disease Control or everywhere else were quite influential. Whereas here, I think the partnership response between community organisations, researchers and government was actually very pragmatic, and it realised that we needed to keep people having sex in pleasurable and safe ways. So when that first observation of men not using condoms in relationships was observed, here it was more of a question, well, why is that happening, rather than freaking out that everything was going wrong. And I think more recently, the reaction to PrEP is an interesting reversal, though. So in the US, PrEP has been heavily promoted by the Centres for Disease Control and other authorities as a proven intervention with randomised control trial data, which they're very keen on. And actually, a large NGO, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, took against it, somewhat to the horror of some of its member organisations, I think. And they were the ones who publicly led this criticism that using PrEP, using Truvada in that way as PrEP, would be irresponsible or encourage promiscuity or it would be used as a party drug. And we seem to have avoided that here, which is great.
It's interesting at a time in HIV where we see investment in partnership declining, to see you attributing a more enlightened approach to health promotion as being a result of partnership. Do you have fears about what's going to happen in the future, in our kind of quite foreseeable future?
Yeah, so there's an interesting tension, isn't there? At the moment, we have this great promise through new strategies, many of which are quite expensive, and they require enormous investment of time and effort to bring to bear to make them actually happen. And at the same time, we have governments, both perhaps more the federal government than state governments, who have very constrained budgets, and they're seeking ways to economise or introduce competitive tendering. And that threatens the partnership response, and particularly least well-funded organisations. And I think we're really feeling that at the moment. And it's tricky. We need those advocacy organisations. Well, advocacy is such a dirty word. We need those advocacy organisations to be strong during this tricky period.
Yeah, and we are also seeing a fragmentation of the response depending on what state you live in. Denton, thank you.
Thanks, and thank you, Martin. I really liked your comparison between, the original safer sex message, sort of, which is how we might think of condoms, and today, reinventing that message. But I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about, sort of the inherent complexity in options available today. Every time Garrett gets up and starts stratifying the different options, the ways that men protect themselves, I become, a little bit overwhelmed and alarmed. And, in some ways that's like a huge reflection of, postmodernism or something like that. But does that impede our ability to convey these messages effectively?
I'm not sure it impedes the capacity to educate people about them, but whether it makes people feel confident. So I have a real question about that's why I was saying there's a great benefit and a price to establishing a norm. And the question is, can you establish a norm about multiple strategies? We don't know. We're going to try, aren't we? So, but when it's condoms only, it's a really simple thing for people to remember. The problem is that hasn't matched reality probably for 20 odd years. And then that creates problems as well, because then people have misguided views about what people should do and what people actually do. And I think that's tricky. But look, this current campaign from ACON is pretty simple. It's got 3 strategies. You avoided negative serious sorting, that's good, well done. The interesting thing will be how it's taken up now and how this works. And if you've seen any of the campaign collateral, you'll see it's all very positive about people being very nice to each other when negotiating sex. Yeah, right. But, you know, it's something to aspire to. You know, and I really think at this moment, people are doing this on the ground, and I suspect those levels of rejection that we're seeing, I would like to see those go down. That would be great. Let's, you know, say yes enthusiastically and no politely.
Martin, a couple of your images have really brought up the question of identity for me. The first one being the David McDermott one that had the big square head with the positive on one side and the negative on the other side. And then the contrast of seeing the recent ACON material that has the -P and the +U. What do you think is happening around sexualised identities for gay men negotiating sex?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So I think so part of that section in there was about, I think, some of the early responses to PrEP and treatment prevention being endorsed, and people going, we can use these and we should tell people about them, and we should give positive people and their partners confidence about relying on undetectable viral load. And that was controversial. That was a big change. Rather than just saying take treatment to be healthy, it was like saying this will prevent transmission. And now PrEP is that inevitably, and there was a whole section of the talk that ended up on the cutting room floor about bringing people, encouraging people to rely more on the clinic and health services and to make use of medical information in their day-to-day lives. And the history of the epidemic shows us that when we do that, so testing is the original example. So testing was supposed to be a medical tool, you know, to diagnose the infectious, but the way it's actually used in practice is people have created status identities and they use that knowledge in their everyday lives, and that was not the original intention. And throughout the epidemic we've seen people make use of biomedical knowledge and information and technology to refashion themselves and to think about themselves in different ways and their relationships with others. And I think we're going to see that, I mean, it's already happening now, but we're going to see that even more as these strategies become more widely used.
Karen, up the back there.
Yeah, hello. Hi, Martin and Bridget. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you to Justice Kirby for being here as well. That's awesome. My name's Karen Price. I'm the Deputy CEO of ACON, so it's going to be no surprise I'm going to talk about the campaign that's before you. Thanks for mentioning it, and thank you for showing so many of our campaign images in your presentation.
You can get me a beer later.
Totally, too. A quick comment on the question you asked, Bridget, actually, about the -P and the +U. That's it. I'm just really grateful that people are using the ending HIV brackets when they do it, so thank you, everyone.
Or, are you sure you didn't copy their brackets?
No, we were first. Anyway, my point is that we obviously, in putting the You Choose, How Do You Do It, You Choose campaign together, we were very mindful of stigma, and particularly stigma against HIV-positive people and the trust that people need to have in undetectable viral load being equally efficacious as a safe sex strategy to PrEP and condoms. When all of those things are used correctly, and I know I'm using loose language here, but when each of those strategies are used to their full effect, they are equally efficacious. And I think that this is early days in that message, I think, for some people. So do you think, Martin, based on your research and also what you know and have been looking at over the time you've been involved, putting them all together in the same line like we have in that campaign, you can see up there, condoms, PrEP, UVL, all together in the same line, talking to the whole community at once about this. How do you feel about that as a strategy, and do you think it will, what's your crystal ball prediction on whether or not you think it will be taken up?
No pressure again, is that right? I actually think putting them in the same campaign is absolutely fine, and I think it's really good. I think ACON was one of the first Australian organisations to claim equivalence between these strategies in terms of effectiveness, and that was back at AIDS 2014. And I think that was the right thing to do, but you haven't kind of brought them all together in exactly the same space like this now. I have questions about how kind and generous people will be to each other about negotiating sex. It's very easy for people to reject each other, and those stats about the experience of HIV-positive men, in particular, negotiating sex, haven't changed very much in decades. So it will be interesting to see if we get some kind of positive momentum there. The other thing which I didn't go into is about these are strategies we are officially endorsing. So that was a very royal we. And of course, as I mentioned in the talk, there are native community strategies like serosorting, which we've had a much more, for negative men, we've had a much more ambivalent relationship to in Australia. And it isn't going to go away quietly. Like that has been the kind of secular strategy for negative men having sex without condoms, preferentially trying to find other negative men and excluding positive men in many cases from the sex they have. And I don't think it will be interesting. I think that's the most interesting interaction. I would dearly love to see those negative men who are serosorting, to go on PrEP or to use condoms more consistently. Those two strategies are much more effective than serosorting. The problem with serosorting, for the uninitiated, for negative men, of course, is you can't tell if your partner is newly infected, and neither can they. And that is the worst situation you want to be in if you're fucking without a condom. So negative serosorters go on PrEP or use condoms more often, or choose partners who are on PrEP or who have an undetectable viral load. But I would love to see the shift there, but I don't know how long that will take. Negative serosorting has been increasing for over a decade, despite our kind of ambivalence about engaging around it.
Martin, we might get back to that idea about using your partner being on PrEP as your safety strategy, but we have a question down here from Cameron.
Yeah, hi, I'm Cam Cox from Sex Workers Outreach Project. Martin, you mentioned earlier that MSM had a much higher rate of condom use than the general community, but there's one small part of the general community that has an extremely high uptake of condoms. And I'm not mentioning that so much as to polish my sex worker halo, but to point out that, we know there's a difference between the emotional sort of headspace that you make decisions in and whether it's a rational headspace or whether it's a more emotional headspace. When I make a decision about condoms in a commercial headspace, it's very rational. When I make it personally, it can be completely different. And I think there's a dynamic there that could be explored and needs to be explored.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. And actually, Cameron, that raises a question for me. There's some really interesting responses to PrEP, in particular, coming from sex workers about, concerns about being expected to be on PrEP, but then also some optimism there among, I believe, male sex workers in particular, going, this might give me more options in my practice. But yeah, also acknowledging that levels of condom use, I think, fair play, have probably remained the highest among sex workers and their clients in Australia, out of all the groups that we work with.
We have a question up here.
Oh, hello, Martin. My name is Mark, and thank you for the talk. Just more as a comment, I've been working for ACON for the last week and a half as part of the...
Welcome.
Yes, for the, what's it called, the gay community periodic
Oh, yeah,
survey.
my baby.
Yes, and yeah, that's one of your projects, actually. Yeah. I've noticed in the last week that I have been conducting the survey in bars, clinics, and SOPVs, which we'll get to that later, I guess. I found that the acronym UVL there, while it's actually quite a few people, gay men and bisexual men, were not aware of the acronym, including some of my co-recruiters, the younger people. They're like, what does UVL mean? Yeah. And so I had to explain.
Yeah, and that's because, of course, so when you're out and about recruiting, you're wearing the U-tubes, the shirts, yeah. The shirts. I should reassure you that the survey does not use an acronym like that. It does actually spell out undetectable viral load. But there's actually a legitimate point there about terminology, and I can remember arguing with clinicians previously about PEP, so post-exposure prophylaxis, which has been knocking around for years, which is a month-long supply of drugs after a potential exposure to HIV, which will stop you getting HIV, which frustratingly only about half of gay men ever seem to know about, and has been publicly available for a long time. And an argument about whether people should know what PEP stands for. Well, they don't need to fucking know what it stands for. They just need to know it exists. And so there's a similar thing so I think PEP and PrEP, although they're annoyingly similar, will gain currency, whether UVL does or viral load might be more, catchy, and people, or treatment prevention, or just taking treatment will be easier for people to remember, I think is important. And kind of documenting the creative ways that people engage with the technology and generate new terms and terminology will be important.
We have a question over here.
Hi, Sukipax. With regard to the condoms PrEP UVL, the slide up there now, there's a difference, it seems to me, between those three things, and it's got to do with interpersonal trust. When you're having sex with someone and they put a condom on, you can see it. When you're having sex with someone who may be on PrEP, you actually have to have, there's an issue of trust in both TASP and PrEP, and I'd like you to comment on that.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. I mean, I'm not sure, it's interesting. So when you look at some of the qualitative studies about condom use, for example, I'm not sure it's quite as straightforward, but usually my reaction has been, it's men who are committed to condom use, like the simplicity of it, they can see it, they can handle it, it's material, they're not kind of wondering what's going on in their body or somebody else's and whether somebody's taken their pill that day and all the rest of it. However, the counterexample is, I think, so some of the work that Asher Person has done with serodiscordant and others of my colleagues have done with serodiscordant couples, also, has actually shown that trust around treatment and viral load can be established. Maybe you need to know your partner a bit better. And I think some of that is familiarity as well. So, I mean, I think certainly the early accounts that are coming out of the PrEP studies are that people are kind of getting used to this idea and being reassured. And sometimes when something is very visible, people go, oh yes, this is a thing and I understand that you're doing it.
Some people like to see test results.
Yeah.
In my study.
Yeah, it's sexy. Total passion killer. Let's get my test results.
We have a question down here.
Hi, I'm Maxine, work for the Heterosexual HIV Service, and congratulations to ACON for this campaign. It's fantastic that condoms, PrEP and UVL are now on a par together and being seen like that. And it would be wonderful if the wider community, if you were saying, Karen, your community would know about it, it's probably not going to happen, but my wish would be for the wider community to know all about this, because our clients find so much trouble in disclosing. And it's interesting also to hear, Tim, you talk about how there's still prejudice about how men are still rejected, because I think there's a perception that we think, oh, the gay guys are all really well educated and they get accepted all the time, but there's still that stigma. And it certainly exists still in the straight community as well. And there's more complexities there too, actually. Perhaps because of some of the ignorance in the straight community. Sometimes it's almost like they don't have the trauma of the past with AIDS. It's almost like sometimes they are more open, in fact, when our clients can get over the trauma of disclosure and diagnosis themselves. So very interesting to see all this out, and I hope it goes further. Also, just a note, the word bisexual men have been mentioned quite a few times there, and just to remember that bisexual men by definition are having sex with women as well, so that's something to remember. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. And I think one of the things I was hoping would come out in the questions is about different communities and actually different notions of safe sex. So I've talked, because of familiarity and also because it's better documented, about kind of a history of safe sex for largely gay men and bisexual men to some degree. A good point was made when I went to ACON at the end of last year by some of the workers who work with women. And if you look at a different population, if the same history will not be there, the same confidence and knowledge in prevention practices, the appropriateness of different prevention practices as well will alter. But I also think internationally, even if we just stayed looking at gay and bisexual men, there will be other countries that never establish the same kind of norms. So there, I think there's a fascinating question as well about introducing biomedical prevention when the background of strategies that have often been referred to as behavioural prevention, although I don't really like that opposition, they may not be as well established, and will the biomedical strategies have more equivalence? Will they be more salient? And I think I struggle a bit with that, particularly in resource-poor settings, about whether there's now a rush to we haven't actually established basic prevention, and you're trying to... Yeah.
We have time for one final question here from Andrew Grulich.
Thanks, Bridget. Thanks, Martin, for a terrific presentation. I think you captured quite nicely what a time we're in at the moment and how rapid the change is. And something about the rapid change is a little bit worrying, I think. Within a year, we've got 5,000 men on PrEP. We've got levels of knowledge about that treatment is prevention up to about 80% of gay men. So your average gay man who's out there having sex is seeing many, many sexual situations where condoms aren't present, or they're intermittently present or not present much at all, which is fine when you're a health literate gay man and you're choosing one of these approaches. But I think much more than has been the case for years now, there's a real danger about men who are not health literate, who are not choosing. They're actually definitely not choosing. And it's almost like follow-on campaigns from this one need to express the importance of how important it is to make a choice and not just to do nothing. Because if you're throwing yourself into this new sexual milieu without having made a choice, but you don't use condoms, then you're not even relying on serosorting, and you're in potentially very high risk situations.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a fair point. And it's very interesting to see. I believe the work that's being done is trying to establish new norms and new protective norms. And it would be nice to see what comes out of the community, from the community side, not just a kind of a top-down organisational response, but also how people respond and how they take this up. I mean, the history of the work that we've done at our centre has been about trying to identify the things that are actually useful, that are generated in the community, and trying to tackle the things that are less useful. So certainly we'll be paying very close attention to what happens there.
Thank you, Martin. I'd like you all to join with me. We are now out of time. To thank Martin, to thank Michael Kirby, to thank Carla and the Centre for Social Health in bringing us here today to discuss sex. Thank you very much.